And then in terms of financial stability on the periphery, I think the view was, well, that can be sort of contained, but for that we can turn to some of these multilateral institutions, maybe the IMF, and we can rely on those kinds of institutions to put the fires out. But along the way, and particularly entering the last decade, I think it had been sort of taken for granted that that could work. But at the same time, people were warning, some people were warning, that maybe the IMF way of solving crises hadn't been that successful in the past, point number one. And point number two, the IMF was incredibly under-resourced, given the scale of many of these economies, the growth in their trade volumes, the growth in their financial sectors, which was placing them, in a sense, at greater and greater risk and in need, should the need arise, for greater financial assistance than perhaps the IMF could disperse. The second old view of what we were thinking before the crisis was unleashed, the second old view I want to talk about is the view that the concern that global imbalances were a problem, were part of the problem, were unsustainable, and it was the main focus of attention of economists in the lead-up to the crisis. So if you remember back in those days, the concern really was that the US might turn out to be insolvent, unable to sustain these imbalances, and some other countries in the so-called Anglosphere were lumped in with that. There was a fear perhaps that when the crash came, it would take the form of a dollar crisis, that the imbalances would be unwound and unraveled in a disorderly fashion. And there was also the concern that, deep down, these imbalances represented something perverse. They were a kind of uphill flow of capital from poor to rich countries that somehow just didn't feel right. And notwithstanding that one could perhaps come up with explanations based on fundamentals and productivity and other reasons for why capital would flow in that direction. So there was all this, fuss and bother about global imbalances, but of course in another example of how when economists make forecasts, things don't turn out at all in the way they predicted, the crisis didn't unfold really in that way at all. There certainly wasn't a dollar crisis, and in the heat of the crisis, of course, the dollar appreciated. It didn't depreciate. That wasn't the form of the problem. And looking forward, there's still not really any sign that these global imbalances are going to go away quickly, and I'll turn back to that. So those are my two major sort of perceptions of where we were in terms of two big issues before the crisis erupted. Then how have we been forced to rethink? Well, I think most importantly, we've been forced to realize that this time isn't different, and that advanced countries as well as developing countries can suffer from financial instability. It's been clear that the financial systems of the developing countries are quite capable of generating junk assets. They're quite capable of suffering a credit freeze. Some countries are capable of having their currency crash or be subject to a great deal of pressure, and we may be on the verge of having an even wider range of defaults than we thought before, with now some sovereigns coming under suspicion that they might not be able to make good, as well as, of course, defaults spreading to other sectors as the recession persists, with commercial real estate, among others, coming into question. We've also had to confront the idea that contagion goes both ways, that instead of focusing maybe in the 90s as we thought, well, we've got to worry about these emerging market crises and how contagion might spread amongst emerging markets, and perhaps maybe in the case of LTCM, contagion could infect Wall Street and cause some problems. Now we have to worry about the fact that contagion can spread from the rich countries to the emerging countries in the opposite direction. And that's a serious revision to our thinking. So as the banks that are large and concentrated in the emerging countries see their balance sheets deteriorate, they cut credit lines across all countries, but also especially to developing countries. And a good example of that was given yesterday in the presentation here about Eastern Europe, and the fact that the credit lines of the Western European banks have been cut dramatically, causing huge problems. Where else have we had to rethink? We thought that the IMF and the multilateral institutions would play a major role in averting any crisis, but I'm going to argue that I don't think that was the reason why Many emerging markets have done very well. I think Santiago made some very good points about fundamentals, and the swap lines were particularly important, perhaps in the case of certain countries. But I think more importantly, the emerging markets that have come well through this crisis were relying basically on their own fundamentals and their own self-insurance, which they had taken care to put in place beforehand. So most importantly, and very wisely, emerging markets accumulated huge reserves hoards, some more than others, but the accumulation of international liquidity in the form of these reserves turned out to be perhaps the most important and wise and prudent precaution that these emerging market countries had taken to insulate themselves from the kind of problems that they had had during previous episodes of crisis. So I think we've come to the understanding that financial stability is more pervasive than we thought. It affects us as well as them. And I think we've also got to confront the probability, the likelihood in my view, that global imbalances will endure. Now, for sure, during the period of the crisis, there's been a huge contraction of trade, perhaps due to trade credit and perhaps due to other reasons, to do with the destocking cycle and other factors related to intermediate goods trade and so forth. But although exports and imports have both collapsed during the period of crisis, they're now starting to rebound, and there's still the sense that the net flows and the net balances are going to be restored as before, maybe not to the same huge magnitude as they were right on the eve of the crisis. But there's now a concern, for those who think it's a problem, that we're going to go back to the previous pattern of global capital flows and trade flows, and I think that's very likely. And the reason I think that's likely is that I think there's an enduring problem here for emerging market countries that they will perceive, and perhaps perceive even more strongly after this event, that they need to have precautionary reserves, and that requires them to run surpluses to accumulate the international liquidity for the smoothing of the shocks, for precautionary saving reasons, to defend their exchange rate against sudden stops of credit or capital flight, because there's still, many of them, in the position of wanting to limit exchange rate instability and protect their financial systems. And many of them still suffer from some currency mismatch. That too has ameliorated during the past 10 years in the aggregate, partly because they have accumulated all of this dollar liquidity. So many of those problems have ameliorated, but they're not gone, and there are still underlying problems, such as the fact that much of the dollar liquidity is in the public sector, in the government coffers, but much of the underlying mismatch is still in the private sector. So there are still potential political economy and redistribution problems as to how this would be deployed in the event that it were needed. But still, in the aggregate, many of these countries are looking a lot safer now. I think Andy Newman and I referred to this yesterday, partly on account of their fundamentals, an important component of which was the war chests of reserves which they had accumulated over the prior decade. So that's, I think, what we've learned. What happens next? Well, I think it's clear that there's a problem, and Francois used the term externality. There's a large negative externality now that's been revealed, more apparent than it was in the past, that a financial crisis in the center of the world economy can emanate and affect lots of other countries, many innocent bystanders, if you will, and that's a huge problem. We never really appreciated the extent of that problem. In a sense, it seems kind of strange, right? Because there's this sort of global savings glut, partly for the structural reasons I alluded to, that countries want to accumulate all this dollar liquidity. So they lend to these, the US is very fortunate, everybody wants to lend and buy US paper, a 2% real interest rate, fine. You think, oh, well, that's really great for us here in the US, we can just borrow very cheaply. There must be oodles of projects that will, get over that 2% hurdle rate. It's great, the rest of the world wants to lend us cheap money. What could possibly go wrong? Well, if you have financial market failure, it turns out a lot can go wrong, especially if that low cost of funding tempts you to borrow a lot and lever up a lot. So mistakes can be compounded by the leverage and sheer volume of borrowing that you want to do under those conditions.